Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 528. The rest is commentary. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by its listeners. Many thanks and much gratefulness to all of the listeners who have gone over to patreon.com/Craftlit and pledged their support to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I have a chapter I've been waiting for to share with you today. And it's kind of an important one. So I'm pretty much just going to dive into this one with the added note that all of the book recommendations and pattern recommendations from this week's Tuesday and Thursday Zoom chats are in the show notes at craftlit.com/528 or at craftlit.libsyn.com. So you have two locations to go and find the fun. Or to make it really easy on yourself, you could just use the app, because we have an app on every OS that you could possibly be using unless you wrote one for yourself. So barring your own personal operating system, we've got you covered. Okay, so way back in the beginning, we talked some about Anne Bronte and the Bronte family in general. So slight refresher, Patrick Bronte, Daddy, is Irish by birth, went to Cambridge, super smart, super educated, really quite a good writer on his own. His wife from Cornwall, her family is Methodists. Her family is Methodist. The Methodists were dissenters. These are religious sects that were outliers from the C of E, the Church of England. So you have a really interesting blend of outsider Irish, outsider Methodist, and then really far too smart children for their own good who have access to a lot of reading material. What you get from this conflation of interesting qualities is you get children who are quite capable of laying on the snark and the melodrama and really getting a kick out of it. Branwell was known to, and this is both from personal accounts from the girls as well as his own chunks of writing that he did, one of which was making fun of Wesleyan-style religious discourse and congregational processes. Branwell would sit there in church and hold his prayer book upside down, be turned to the wrong page, occasionally with a pencil, perhaps add some marginalia to his prayer book or hymnal. There was a certain amount of irreligiosity coming from Branwell. Emily had her own take on things, and she has her characters in Wuthering Heights on more than one occasion behaving rather irreligiously. Charlotte may come off as quite pious in some ways in Jane Eyre. However, she too had, I'm using air quotes, conversations with religious training and doctrine. Where it gets really interesting, though, is Anne. And I believe I mentioned this in passing, but without making a big deal of it. And then this week, something happened. And I will be following up on this when I'm able to. They're closed right now. What happened was this. Aaron, my thing one, got his first job, and he is working as a cave tour guide at this little family-run cave about 40 minutes north of us here in Pennsylvania. It's really cool. It was as though a job was designed for my wackadoodle son. So it's a great, but it's also a long drive. He has never driven country roads like this for such a long distance for any sustained amount of time. So the first 2 days that he went to work, I went up with him. Obviously, with all of the COVID-19, whatever, it was going to be a crapshoot whether anything would be open. Like, could I just stay up there and work on my computer or write or something? Would there be anywhere for me to sit and, for example, get a lemonade? The answer was yes and no. The first place that I tried to go to was called Steel Stacks, and I'm linking out to it from the show notes. Like the torpedo factory in Arlington, Virginia, and so many other places around the world, Steel Stacks was a steel work. It was the smelter. It was the railroad connects directly so that you could unload your ore from the train and then reload steel beams and whatever that needed to go out to be used by the rest of the country. This was clearly a well-oiled machine, both literally and metaphorically, and it was so obviously the life's blood of this part of Pennsylvania, but also the pumping heart for the arteries of train lines all over the United States. Steel Stacks was, in particular, run by, originally, a company you may have heard of, Bethlehem Steel. Billy Joel did a song in the late 70s, early 80s, Allentown. Allentown is around the corner from Bethlehem. They were both steel towns. Pittsburgh, steel town. There's a lot of steel stuff that was going on in Pennsylvania. We also in Pennsylvania have Amish, we have Pennsylvania Dutch, we have Eastern European, we have everybody. We have a whole interesting dumpster load of unique types who have managed to maintain a certain amount of their own history. And by maintaining it and sharing it, they have disseminated that history amongst the rest of Pennsylvania. So there are a lot of things here that still seem to be, to me, influenced by Quakers. Quakers were a big part of Pennsylvania. This was a safe place for them to go. This was a safe place for a lot of outsiders to go back in the day, and still. Why am I bringing all of this up when we're talking about Anne Bronte? Here is why. After I visited Steel Stacks, which was largely closed, but what it is now it's an arts venue and museum center for learning a little bit about our historic steel industry here. And they've also taken all of this old rusting steel, and I did take pictures of this and I did a little painting of it on my Instagram account, if you're interested in seeing that. I went and walked around as much as I could. A lot of it was still closed, so I wasn't able to get into the museum space, even though I had a mask. So instead, I went to downtown Bethlehem to check it out because, of course, last I heard, in Billy Joel's song Allentown, everything around here was quite economically depressed. Not so Bethlehem. Bethlehem has really brought itself back. Its downtown area is lovely, charming. They had shut off half of the main drag so that they could have tables and chairs out on the sidewalk and into the street. It was lovely. I went to a marvelous little pub called McCarthy's that was on a side street. I sat there in the shade, painting and having a lovely time with all of the wonderful people there. And on my way back to the car, I walked by a historical marker that said Moravian Historical Society. And my brain exploded because when Anne Bronte was at Roe Head School when she was 17, she got very sick. And as we know from Bronte family history, getting very sick while at school, not really a good thing to have happen to you. But her illness, which did include trouble breathing and apparently some trouble with food and digestion, her illness also apparently led her to some kind of crisis of conscience or religious crisis, which one might think would be a bit odd for the daughter of a minister, especially a minister who didn't seem to shut his children down. It appears that they were all able to discuss and argue, not angrily, but argue logically, issues surrounding the Bible and religion and translation of the Bible, understanding of the Bible. Be that as it may, Anne, when removed from the presence of her father, found herself in a bit of a religious state, and the minister who was able to get to her was a Moravian minister. Now, I have read this in dozens of texts. And they all either didn't have a clue what that meant, but they were recopying it because Moravian has a capital letter in front of it. And as a proper noun, maybe it meant something to other people. And they just had no clue why. Or I was expected to just know what this meant. And it does appear that Moravian churches are more common in Britain than they are in the United States, except for in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where apparently there are still a lot of Moravians. So, why does this matter? It matters because Moravians are cool. And I don't just mean cool like, oh my gosh, that's so neat. I mean, they're real chill. They have, if I was going to put them on a scale between like the strictest, most Calvinist view of God and religion, all the way to like free love, do what you want, I would have them in the chill center. They're right there with like Unitarians. I'm not even going to try and describe it. I'm just going to read some stuff to you. Okay, so Moravian Church was first started in 1457. They had some problems with the Counter-Reformation and they got persecuted. And then the people who were left of the Moravian Church, and this Moravia's in Bohemia, so German-ish, although I'm sure the Bohemians would be happier to be identified as Bohemian rather than German. Anyway, so that part of the world, they have some persecution issues and they have to get out of there, and they wind up on the land of a guy named Count Zinzendorf, who was friendly to them. That was 1727. So they're refugees from Moravia, but they get permission from Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf to stay there in Saxony. This is near the present-day border of Poland. So Zinzendorf is also Moravian and apparently is just a fabulous dude. In 1977, a British bishop of the Moravian Church came to the Moravian Theological Seminary in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and gave a talk. And he did the best job I've found of summing up what makes the Moravian belief system different and why the Moravian minister had such a huge effect on Anne Bronte. Okay, so the spirit of the Moravian Church has 5 characteristics. These characteristics are simplicity, happiness, unintrusiveness, fellowship, and the ideal of service, doing things for other people. So to break that down a little bit further and give some clarity there, simplicity has a lot to do with the concept of grace. So Zinzendorf made a remark, the apostles say, we believe we have salvation through the grace of Jesus Christ. And then Zinzendorf went on to say, if I can only teach a person that catechism, I have made him a divinity scholar for all time. That rang bells for me for this reason. Hillel, one of the historic rabbis in Judaism, there's this story in the Babylonian Talmud that is told of him. These are all stories. Here's this short story. Once upon a time, there was a Gentile who came before Shammai, different rabbi, and said to him, I'll let you convert me on the condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. Shammai kind of went, yeah, whatever. Pushed him aside with the cane with his walking stick that he was holding and went on his way. The same Gentile came before Rabbi Hillel, and Hillel successfully converted him because what he said was, that which is despicable to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go learn it. In the Moravian Church, we have, if I can only teach a person that we believe in the salvation through the grace of Jesus Christ, then I have made him a divinity scholar for all time. This fundamental belief in grace was huge for Anne Bronte, but we need to continue. So first we have simplicity, the simplicity of the belief in grace. Second, we have happiness. Zinzendorf identified it thusly. This is a quote. "There is a difference between a genuine pietist and a genuine Moravian. The pietist has his sin in the foreground and looks at the wounds of Jesus. The Moravian has the wounds in the foreground and looks from them upon his sin. The pietist in his timidity is comforted by the wounds. The Moravian in his happiness is shamed by his sin." Going on, unintrusiveness. This is based on the belief that God positively wants a variety of churches because we are such a varied world. We have lots of people with lots of different spiritual need. There's no reason to try and convert other people to your way of thinking. It's not a zero-sum game. So they don't need to go out and proselytize or try and convert anyone because they figure just showing up and being a good Moravian is about the best you can do for yourself and your group. Next comes fellowship, and here's where the Pennsylvania part of it really kicks in for me. The British bishop speaking in 1977 said, "The Moravian ideal has been to gather together kindred hearts. Where there are Christian hearts in love united, their fellowship is possible in spite of differences of intellect and intelligence, of thought, opinion, taste, and outlook." And then he goes on to say, back in Zinzendorf's time in 1727, fellowship meant not only a bridging of theological differences, but also of social differences. The artisan and the aristocrat were brought together as brothers and sat as equal members on the same committee. I want you just to sit with that for a minute and remember that came from 1727. I know it's kind of earth-shattering, and it does make a certain amount of sense why this would really resonate with Anne Bronte. And the last element of Moravian thought that we are going to take a look at is the idea of service. This is happily going about being a servant, not just a servant of God, but by extension, extending the blessing of God to the entire world. This is very much the Jewish concept of tikkun olam. This is healing the world, bringing the world back together and putting it back together so that all of its beauty and majesty can be seen and experienced by everyone. The metaphor symbol that's used in Judaism is an old, again, another old midrash or story that when God first created the universe, it was inside a beautiful crystal glass vessel, and it was too much. It was too extraordinary, and it shattered. And that our job is to, through being good and doing good, slowly over time collect all of the beautiful shards and bring them back together again and heal the world. So this is also very much in keeping with the Moravian way of looking at things. They're big proponents of education, big on being genuine, being practical, all of these things that, or whatever part of these things that Anne Bronte heard about from her Moravian minister made a huge, huge effect on her, specifically when it came to damnation. She could not reconcile a loving God allowing anyone, to burn in hell for eternity. Eternity was a little too long for there to be a loving God. And so she had to come up with some kind of calculus in her mind to reconcile these two competing thoughts. And you are going to hear how she did it. It's tricky because Helen's character is pious enough to be a good girl, but she hasn't really made it clear that she is a religious scholar of any sort so far. So this is one of those turning points where she has an Anne moment, and if Anne were not as good a writer as she is, this would be a one-off and we would let it go. But it does come back again and again and again. Of course, it's certainly not a surprise that Helen Graham would have been reading her Bible as a young woman. She's not an idiot. She would have been thinking about these things and having conversations, at least in her own head, about these things. And that is one of the points she makes. She does understand that the threat of hellfire is probably a useful deterrent. So she wouldn't necessarily want to go spreading around her vision of how grace works. And she says that. But as a private theology, you are going to hear more of an intimate expression of Anne Bronte's brain and heart in our second chapter today than you have seen so far. So I had a choice to make. I didn't know if I should give you all of that information before you listen or after, and I finally decided on before because I wanted to give you a heads up, but I also want to make sure that you really hear the theological argument Helen has with her aunt for the Anness that it also projects to all of us. Okay? So there are some funny moments in 19 and 20. There are some really heartbreakingly sad moments in 19 and 20. And there is a fascinating religious theological debate happening in 20. And all of this matters. All right, that's it. I'm turning you over to Maya Daguerre reading chapters 19 and 20 for us from The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. Here we go.
Chapter 20. Persistence. September 24th. In the morning I rose light and cheerful, nay, intensely happy. The hovering cloud cast over me by my aunt's views and by the fear of not obtaining her consent was lost in the bright effulgence of my own hopes and the too delightful consciousness of requited love. It was a splendid morning, and I went out to enjoy it in a quiet ramble in company with my own blissful thoughts. The dew was on the grass, and 10,000 gossamers were waving in the breeze. The happy redbreast was pouring out its little soul in song, and my heart overflowed with silent hymns of gratitude and praise to heaven. But I had not wandered far before my solitude was interrupted by the only person that could have disturbed my musings at that moment. Without being looked upon as an unwelcome intruder, Mr. Huntington came suddenly upon me. So unexpected was the apparition that I might have thought it the creation of an overexcited imagination, had the sense of sight alone borne witness to his presence. But immediately I felt his strong arm around my waist and his warm kiss on my cheek, while his keen and gleeful salutation, "My own Helen," was ringing in my ear. "Not yours yet," I said, hastily swerving aside from this too presumptuous greeting. "Remember my guardians. You will not easily attain my aunt's consent. Don't you see she is prejudiced against you?" "I do, dearest, and you must tell me why, that I must best know how to combat her objections. I suppose she thinks I am a prodigal," pursued he, observing that I was unwilling to reply, "and concludes that I shall have but little worldly goods wherewith to endow my better half. If so, you must tell her that my property is mostly entailed, and I cannot get rid of it. There may be a few mortgages on the rest, a few trifling debts and encumbrances here and there, but nothing to speak of, and though I acknowledge I am not so rich as I might be, or have been, still I think we could manage pretty comfortably on what's left. My father, you know, was something of a miser, and in his latter days especially saw no pleasure in life but to amass riches, and so it is no wonder that his son should make it his chief delight to spend them, which was according to the case, until my acquaintance with you, dear Helen, taught me other views and nobler aims, and the very idea of having you to care for under my roof would force me to moderate my expenses and live like a Christian, not to speak of all the prudence and virtue you would instil into my mind by your wise counsels and sweet attractive goodness. But it is not that, said I. It is not money my aunt thinks about. She knows better than to value worldly wealth above its price. What is it then? She wishes me to marry none but a really good man. What? A man of decided piety? Ahem. Well, come, I'll manage that too. It's Sunday today, is it? I'll go to church, morning, afternoon, and evening, and comport myself in such a godly sort that she shall regard me with admiration and sisterly love as a brand plucked from the burning. I'll come home sighing like a furnace, and full of the savour and unction of dear Mr. Blayton's discourse. Mr. Layton, I said dryly. Is Mr. Layton a sweet preacher, Helen? A dear, delightful, heavenly-minded man? He is a good man, Mr. Huntingdon. I wish I could say half as much for you. Oh, I forget you are a saint too. I crave your pardon, dearest, but don't call me Mr. Huntingdon. My name is Arthur. I'll call you nothing, for I have nothing at all to do with you, if you talk in that way any more. If you really mean to deceive my aunt, as you say, you are very wicked, and if not, you are very wrong to jest on such a subject. I stand corrected, said he, concluding his laugh with a sorrowful sigh. Now, resumed he, after a momentary pause, let us talk about something else. And come nearer to me, Helen, and take my arm, and then I'll let you alone. I can't be quiet while I see you walking there. I complied, but said we must soon return to the house. No one will be down to breakfast yet, for long enough, he answered. You spoke of your guardians just now, Helen, but is not your father still living? Yes, but I always look upon my uncle and aunt as my guardians, for they are so indeed, though not in name. My father has entirely given me up to their care, and I have never seen him since dear mamma died when I was a very little girl, and my aunt, at her request, offered to take charge of me and took me away to Stanningley, where I've remained ever since. And I don't think he would object to anything for me that she thought proper to sanction. But would he sanction anything which she thought proper to object? No, I don't think he cares enough about me. He is very much to blame, but he doesn't know what an angel he has for a daughter, which is all the better for me, as if he did, he would not be willing to part with such a treasure. And, Mr. Huntingdon, said I suppose you know I am not an heiress. He protested that he had never given it thought, and begged I would not disturb his present enjoyment by the mention of such uninteresting subjects. I was glad of this proof of disinterested affection, for Annabella Wilmot is the probable heiress to all her uncle's wealth, in addition to her late father's property, which she has already in possession. I now insisted upon retracing our steps to the house, but we walked slowly and went on talking as we proceeded. I need not repeat all we said. Let me rather refer to what passed between my aunt and me after breakfast, when Mr. Huntingdon called my uncle aside, no doubt to make his proposals, and she beckoned me into another room, where she once more commenced a solemn remonstrance, which, however, entirely failed to convince me that her view of the case was preferable to my own. You judge him uncharitably, aunt, I know, said I. His very friends are not half as bad as you represent them. There is Walter Hargrave, Millicent's brother, for one. He is but a little lower than the angels, if half she says of him is true. She's continually talking to me about him and lauding his many virtues to the skies. You will form a very inadequate estimate of a man's character, replied she, if you judge by what a fond sister says of him. The worst of them generally knows how to hide their misdeeds from their sisters' eyes and their mothers too. And there is Lord Loughborough, continued I, quite a decent man. Who told you so? Lord Loughborough is a desperate man. He has dissipated his fortune in gambling and other things, and is now seeking an heiress to retrieve it. I told Miss Wilmot so, but you're all alike. She haughtily answered that she was very much obliged to me, but believed she knew when a man was seeking her for her fortune and when for herself. She flattered herself she had had experience enough in those matters to be justified in trusting to her own judgment. And as for his lordship's lack of fortune, she cared nothing about that, and she hoped her own would suffice for both. As for his wildness, she supposed he was no worse than others. Besides, he was reformed now. Yes, they can all play the hypocrite when they want to take in a fond, misguided woman. Well, I think he's about as good as she is, said I. But when Mr. Huntingdon is married, he won't have many opportunities of consorting with his bachelor friends, and the worse they are, the more I long to deliver him from them. To be sure, my dear, and the worse he is, I suppose, the more you long to deliver him from himself. Yes, providing he's not incorrigible. That is, the more I long to deliver him from his faults, to give him an opportunity of shaking off the adventitious evil got from contact with others worse than himself, and shining out in the unclouded light of his own genuine goodness, to do my utmost to help his better self against his worse, and make him what he would have been if he had not from the beginning had a bad, selfish, miserly father, who so gratified his own sordid passions, restricted him in the most innocent enjoyments of childhood and youth, and so disgusted him with every kind of restraint, and a foolish mother who indulged him to the top of his bent, deceiving her husband for him, and doing her utmost to encourage those germs of folly and vice it was her duty to suppress. And then such a set of companions as you represent his friends to be. Poor man, she said sarcastically. His kind have greatly wronged him. They have, cried I, and they shall wrong him no more. His wife shall undo what his mother did. Well, she said, after a short pause, I must say, Helen, I thought better of your judgment than this, and your taste too. How you can love such a man I cannot tell, or what pleasure you can find in his company. For what fellowship hath light with darkness, or he that believeth with an infidel? He is not an infidel, and I am not light, and he is not darkness. His worse and his only vice is thoughtlessness. And thoughtlessness, pursued my aunt, may lead to every crime, and will but poorly excuse our errors in the sight of God. Mr. Huntington, I suppose, is not without the common faculties of man. He is not so light-headed as to be irresponsible. His Maker has endowed him with reason and conscience as well as the rest of us. The Scriptures are open to him as well as to others, and if he will not hear them, neither will he hear though one rose from the dead. And remember, Helen, continued she solemnly, the wicked shall be turned into hell, and they that forget God. And suppose even that he should continue to love you, and you him, and that you should pass through life together with tolerable comfort. How will it be in the end, when you see yourself parted for ever, you perhaps taken into eternal bliss, and he cast into the lakes that burneth with unquenchable fire, there for ever to— Not for ever, I exclaimed, only till he has paid the utmost farthing. For if any man's work abide not the fire, he shall suffer loss, yet himself shall be saved, but so as by fire. And he that is able to subdue all things to himself will have all men to be saved, and will in the fullness of time gather together in one all things in Christ Jesus, who tasted death for every man, and in whom God will reconcile all things to himself, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. Oh, Helen, where did you learn all this? In the Bible, Aunt. I have searched it through and found nearly 30 passages, all tending to support the same theory. And is that the use you make of your Bible? And did you find no passages tending to prove the danger and falsity of such a belief? No. I found indeed some passages that, taken by themselves, may seem to contradict that opinion, but they will all bear different construction to that which is commonly given, and in the only difficulty is the word which translates everlasting or eternal. I don't know the Greek, but I believe it strictly means for ages, and might signify either endless or long enduring. And as for the danger of the belief, I would not publish it abroad, if I thought any poor wretch would be likely to presume upon it to his own destruction. But it is a glorious thought to cherish in one's own heart. I would not part with it for all the world can give. Here our conference ended, for it was now high time to prepare for church. Everyone attended the morning service except my uncle, who hardly ever goes, and Mr. Wilmot, who stayed at home with him to enjoy a quiet game of cribbage. In the afternoon, Mrs. Wilmot and Lord Loughborough likewise excused themselves for attending, but Mr. Huntington vouchsafed to accompany us again. Whether it was to ingratiate himself with my aunt, I cannot tell, but if so, he certainly should have behaved better. I must confess I did not like his conduct during service at all. Holding his prayer book upside down, or open at any place but the right, he did nothing but stare about him, unless he happened to catch my aunt's eye or mine, and then he would drop his own to his book, with a puritanical air of mock solemnity that would have been ludicrous if it had not been too provoking. Once during the sermon, after attentively regarding Mr. Layton for a few minutes, he suddenly produced his gold pencil case and snatched up a Bible. Perceiving that I observed the movement, he whispered that he was going to make a note of the sermon. But instead of that, as I sat next to him, I could not help seeing that he was making a caricature of the preacher, giving to the respectable, pious, elderly gentleman the air and aspect of a most absurd old hypocrite. And yet, upon his return, he talked to my aunt about the sermon with a degree of modest, serious discrimination that tempted me to believe he really had attended and profited by the discourse. Just before dinner, my uncle called me into the library for a discussion of a very important matter, which was dismissed in a few words. "Now, Nell," said he, "this young Huntington has been asking for you. What must I say about it? Your aunt would answer no, but what say you?" "I say yes, uncle," replied I, without a moment's hesitation, for I have thoroughly made up my mind on the subject. "Very good," cried he. "Now that's a good honest answer. Wonderful for a girl. Well, I'll write to your father tomorrow. He's sure to give his consent. So you may look to the matter as settled. You'd have done a great deal better if you'd have taken Wilmot, I can tell you. But that you won't believe. At your time of life, it's love that rules the roast. At mine, it's solid, serviceable gold. I suppose now you'd never dream of looking into a state of your husband's finances, or troubling your head about settlements or anything of that sort." "I don't think I should." "Well, be thankful then that you've wiser heads to think for you. I haven't had time yet to examine thoroughly into this young rascal's affairs, but I see that a great part of his father's fine property has been squandered away. But still I think there's a pretty fair share of it left, and a little careful nursing may make a handsome thing of it yet. And then we must persuade your father to give you a decent fortune, as he has only one besides you to care for, and if you behave well, who knows but what I might be induced to remember you in my will," continued he, putting his finger to his nose with a knowing wink. "Thanks, uncle, for that and all your kindness," replied I. "Well, and I questioned this young spark on the matter of settlements," continued he, "and he seemed disposed to be generous enough on that point." "I knew he would," said I, "but pray don't trouble your head, or his or mine, about that. For all I have will be his, and all he has will be mine. So what more could either of us require?" And I was about to make my exit, but he called me back. "Stop, stop!" cried he. "We haven't mentioned the time yet. When must it be? Your aunt would put it off till Lord knows when, but he's anxious to be bound as soon as may be. He won't hear of waiting beyond the next month. And you, I guess, will be of the same mind, so—" "Not at all, uncle. On the contrary, I should like to wait till after Christmas at least." "Oh, pooh-pooh, never tell me that tale. I know better," cried he, and he persisted in his incredulity. "Nevertheless, it's quite true. I'm in no hurry at all. How can I be, when I think of the momentous change that awaits me and all I have to leave? It is happiness enough to know that we are to be united, that he really loves me, and I may love him as devotedly and think of him as often as I please. However, I insisted upon consulting my aunt about the time of the wedding, for I determined her counsels should not be utterly disregarded, and no conclusions on that particular are come to yet. Chapter 19. An Incident. 22nd. Night. What have I done, and what will be the end of it? I cannot calmly reflect upon it. I cannot sleep. I must have recourse to my diary again. I will commit it to paper tonight and see what I shall think of it tomorrow. I went down to dinner, resolving to be cheerful and well conducted, and kept my resolution very creditably, considering how my head ached and how internally wretched I felt. I don't know what has come over me of late. My very energies, both mental and physical, must be strangely impaired, or I should not have acted so weakly in many respects as I have done. But I've not been well this last day or two, and I suppose it's with sleeping and eating so little and thinking so much and being so continually out of humour. But to return, I was exerting myself to sing and play for the amusement and at the request of my aunt and Millicent, before the gentlemen came into the drawing-room. Miss Wilmot never likes to waste her musical efforts on ladies' ears alone. Millicent had asked for a little Scotch song, and I was just in the middle of it when they entered. The first thing Mr. Huntington did was to walk up to Annabella. "Now, Miss Wilmot, won't you give us some music tonight?" said he. Do now, I know you will, when I tell you that I have been hungering and thirsting all day for the sound of your voice. Come, the piano's vacant." It was, for I had quitted it immediately upon hearing his petition. Had I been endowed with a proper degree of self-possession, I should have turned to the lady myself and cheerfully joined my entreaties to his, whereby I should have disappointed his expectations if the affront had been purposefully given, or made him sensible of the wrong if it had only arisen from thoughtlessness. But I felt it too deeply to do anything but rise from the music-stool and throw myself back on the sofa, suppressing with difficulty the audible expression of the bitterness I felt within. I knew Annabella's musical talents were superior to mine, but that was no reason why I should be treated as a perfect nonentity. The time and manner of his asking her appeared like a gratuitous insult to me, and I could have wept with pure vexation. Meantime, she exultantly seated herself at the piano and favoured him with two of his favourite songs in such a superior style that even I soon lost my anger in admiration, and listened with a sort of gloomy pleasure to the skilful modulations of her full-toned and powerful voice, so judiciously aided by her rounded and spirited touch, and while my ears drank in the sound, my eyes rested on the face of her principal auditor, and derived an equal or superior delight from the contemplation of his speaking countenance, as he stood beside her. That iron brow lightened up with keen enthusiasm, and that sweet smile passing and appearing like gleams of sunshine on an April day. No wonder he should hunger and thirst to hear her sing. I now forgave him from my heart his reckless slight of me, and I felt ashamed at my pettish resentment of such a trifle, ashamed too of all those bitter envious pangs that gnawed my innermost heart, in spite of all this admiration and delight. "There now," said she, playfully running her fingers over the keys, when she had concluded the second song. "What shall I give you next?" But in saying this, she looked back at Lord Loughborough, who was standing a little behind, leaning against the back of a chair, an attentive listener too, experiencing, to judge by his countenance, much the same feelings of mingled pleasure and sadness as I did. But the look she gave him plainly said, "Do you choose for me now? I have done enough for him, and I will gladly exert myself to gratify you." And thus encouraged, his lordship came forward, and turning over the music, presently set before her a little song that I had noticed before, and read more than once with an interest arising from the circumstances of my connecting it in my mind with the reigning tyrant of my thoughts. And now, with my nerves already excited and half unstrung, I could not hear those words so sweetly warbled forth, without some symptoms of emotion I was not able to suppress. Tears rose unbidden to my eyes, and I buried my face in the sofa pillow that they may flow unseen while I listened. The air was simple and sweet and sad, and it is still running in my head, and so are the words. "Farewell to thee, but not farewell to all my fondest thoughts of thee. Within my heart they shall still dwell, and they shall cheer and comfort me. O beautiful and full of grace, if thou hadst never met mine eye, I had not dreamed a living face could fancy charms so far outvie. If I may ne'er behold again that form and face so dear to me, nor hear thy voice, still I would fain preserve for aye their memory. That voice, the magic of whose tone can wake an echo in my breast, creating feelings that alone can make my tranced spirit blessed. That laughing eye whose sunny beams my memory would not cherish less, and oh, that smile whose joyous gleam no mortal language can express. Adieu, but let me cherish still the hope with which I cannot part. Contempt may wound the coldness chill, but still it lingers in my heart. And who can tell but heaven at last may answer all my thousand prayers, and bid the future pay the past with joys for anguish, smiles for tears." When it ceased, I longed for nothing so much as to be out of the room. The sofa was not far from the door, but I did not dare to raise my head, for I knew Mr. Huntington was standing near me, and I knew by the sound of his voice, as he spoke in answer to some remark of Lord Loughborough's, that his face was turned towards me. Perhaps a half-suppressed sob had caught his ear and had caused him to look round. Heaven forbid. But with a violent effort I checked all further signs of weakness, dried my eyes, and when I thought he had turned away again, rose and instantly left the apartment, taking refuge in my favourite resort, the library. There was no light there but the faint red glow of the neglected fire, but I did not want the light. I only wanted to indulge my thoughts unnoticed and undisturbed, and sitting down on a low stool before the easy chair, I sunk my head upon its cushioned seat, and thought until the tears gushed out again, and I wept like any child. Presently, however, the door was gently opened, and someone entered the room. I trusted it was only a servant and did not stir. The door was closed again, but I was not alone. A hand gently touched my shoulder, and a voice said softly, "Helen, what is the matter?" I could not answer at the moment. "You must and shall tell me," was added more vehemently, and the speaker threw himself on his knees beside me on the rug and forcibly possessed himself of my hand. But I hastily caught it away and replied, "It is nothing to you, Mr. Huntingdon." "Are you sure it is nothing to me?" he returned. "Can you swear that you were not thinking of me while you wept?" This was unendurable. I made an effort to rise, but he was kneeling on my dress. "Tell me," continued he. "I want to know, because if you were, I have something to say to you, and if not, I'll go." "Go then," I cried. But fearing he would obey too well and never come again, I hastily added, "Or say what you have to say and have done with it." "But which?" said he, "for I shall only say it if you really were thinking of me. So tell me, Helen." "You are excessively impertinent, Mr. Huntingdon." "Not at all. Too pertinent, you mean. So you won't tell me? Well, I'll spare your woman's pride, and construing your silence into yes, I'll take it for granted that I was the subject of your thoughts and the cause of your affliction." "Indeed, sir." "If you deny it, I won't tell you my secret," threatened he, and I did not interrupt him again, or even attempt to repulse him, though he had taken my hand once more and half embraced me with his other arm. I was scarcely conscious of it at the time. "It is this," resumed he, "that Annabella Wilmot, in comparison with you, is like a flaunting peony compared with a sweet wild rosebud gemmed with dew, and I love you to distraction. Now tell me if that intelligence gives you any pleasure." Silence again? That means yes. Then let me add that I cannot live without you, and if you answer no to this last question, you will drive me mad. Will you bestow yourself upon me? "You will," he cried, nearly squeezing me to death in his arms. "No, no," I exclaimed, struggling to free myself from him. "You must ask my uncle and aunt. They won't refuse me if you don't." "I'm not sure of that. My aunt dislikes you." But you don't, Helen. Say you love me and I'll go." "I wish you would go," I replied. "I will, this instant, if only you say you love me." "You know I do," I answered. And again he caught me in his arms and smothered me with kisses. At that moment my aunt opened wide the door and stood before us, candle in hand, in shocked and horrified amazement, gazing alternately at Mr. Huntingdon at me, for we both started up and now stood wide enough asunder. But his confusion was only for a moment. Rallying in an instant, with a most enviable assurance, he began, "I beg 10,000 pardons, Mrs. Maxwell. Don't be too severe upon me. I've been asking your sweet niece to take me for better or worse, and she, like a good girl, informs me that she cannot think of it without her uncle and aunt's consent. So let me implore you not to condemn me to eternal wretchedness. If you favour my cause, I am safe, for Mr. Maxwell, I am certain, can refuse you nothing." "We will talk of this tomorrow, sir," said my aunt coldly. "It is a subject that demands mature and serious deliberation. At present you had better return to the drawing-room." "But meantime," pleaded he, "let me command my cause to your most indulgent. No indulgence for you, Mr. Huntingdon, must come between me and the consideration of my niece's happiness." "Ah, true. I know she is an angel, and I am a presumptuous dog to dream of possessing such a treasure. But nevertheless, I would sooner die than relinquish her in favour of the best man that ever went to heaven. And as for her happiness, I would sacrifice my body and soul. Body and soul, Mr. Huntingdon? Sacrifice your soul? Well, I would lay down life. You would not be required to lay it down. I would spend it then, devote my life and all its powers to the promotion and preservation. Another time, sir, we will talk of this. And I should have felt disposed to judge more favourably of your pretensions if you too had chosen another time and place, and, let me add, another manner for your declaration. Why, you see, Mrs. Maxwell, he began. Pardon me, sir, said she with dignity. The company are inquiring for you in the other room. And she turned to me. Then you must plead for me, Helen, he said, and at length withdrew. You had better retire to your room, Helen, said my aunt gravely, and I will discuss this matter with you tomorrow. Don't be angry, aunt, said I. My dear, I am not angry, she replied. I am surprised. If it is true that you told him you could not accept his offer without our consent. It is true, interrupted I. Then how could you permit? I couldn't help it, aunt, I cried, bursting into tears. They were not altogether tears of sorrow or fear for her displeasure, but rather the outbreak of the general tumultuous excitement of my feelings. But my good aunt was touched at my agitation. In a softer tone, she repeated her recommendation to retire, and gently kissing my forehead, bade me good night, and put her candle in my hand. And I went, but my brain worked so I could not think of sleeping. I feel calmer now that I have written all this, and I will go to bed and try to win tired nature's sweet restorer.
Well, that happened. Don't you think it's interesting that Helen doesn't want to get married right away? Her uncle expects her to. Her uncle's even kind of pushing her to. And she's, no. I mean, it's great that he wants to marry me, but I'm in no rush. She actually seems to have quite a bit of independence, as she does right now in Stanningley with her aunt and uncle, to a certain extent. So I can kind of see why she might not be in a huge rush to move past this kind of romantic interim phase. Huntington's certainly excited, too. So a lot happened. And if you are up on your New Testament, then you probably heard a lot of biblical lines getting smashed up together with a lot of other lines from other chapters. And you are exactly correct. Anne Bronte was mixing and matching 2 Corinthians, Matthew, Luke, Book of Revelation. There was a lot that she was throwing in there, along with her own little discourse on theology, her belief that God wouldn't let you burn in hell forever. For long enough, sure, to learn your lesson, pay for your sins, all of that stuff. She did go to the story of Lazarus, let him dip his finger in water and cool my lips. This is one of the scenes from Godspell, if you've seen Godspell. And it is actually the Father Abraham song, which is the one that I had gotten when I was in high school in Godspell. And it has some of the best tongue twisters. The I can see a swath of sinners setting yonder and they're acting like a pack of fools. That's this song. And that's the story that Helen's aunt goes to in part of her conversation here, where she said, look, the scripture is open to him as well as others. He has every opportunity to educate himself on this front. And he knows that his behavior hasn't been 100% great. So then she goes on and says, if he hear not them, neither will he hear though one rose from the dead. This is the rich man goes to hell. Lazarus, the poor beggar with open sores, goes and is kept safe in the bosom of Abraham. And the rich man calls up to heaven and says, let Lazarus come down here and give me some cool water. And Abraham says, no, there's this giant gulf between us and we can't get to you and you can't get to us. And that's the way it's got to be. And then the rich man says, okay, well then send Lazarus back to tell my brothers so that they don't wind up in the same situation that I'm in. And that is if they won't listen to the scriptures right now, they're not going to listen to anyone, even if somebody rose from the dead, even if Lazarus came back to life and told them. These people's ears are plugged. They are not listening. And Helen's aunt is using this as part of her response to Helen's enormous act of hubris. Let me fix what his mom screwed up. Which, boy, if that didn't just run chills down your spine, whoo boy. His parents were really bad to him. I'm going to make it all better. I'm the one who can do it. Oh. And Helen's aunt doesn't end there. She does say, how will it be in the end days, when you're dead, when you see yourselves parted forever, when he is in hell, like the rich man, and you, like Lazarus, are in heaven. And then she takes it one step further and says, when you perhaps are taken into eternal bliss, and he cast into the lake that burneth with unquenchable fire. Unquenchable fire is from the book of Revelation. So we have a whole lot of theological stuff going on in just this half of a page. And then the next paragraph has more footnotes than I've ever seen smashed into one paragraph before. All of it is the conflated, not confused, but conflated biblical text where Helen/Anne is smashing together different lines from different places. She goes on to say, yeah, I know I don't know all the Greek and Hebrew. However, from what my study has indicated, the particular Greek word that's being used in the Bible doesn't mean forever. It means for a really long time. There's a difference between endless and an end that is a really long way out. I think what makes Anne Bronte a really interesting writer is that after she gives her first kind of real hardcore volley in this theological debate and spills it, this is my philosophy of how God runs the universe. Her aunt's response is one of shock. And she gets the, oh, Helen, where did you learn all this? Which is legit. This is Anne Bronte / Helen Graham is saying a lot of stuff that was not canon at the time. So Anne has given you a real theological debate, which, usually when writers, especially first time, second time writers out of the gate, they give you things like this. It's very heavily one-sided. They are absolutely selling their point of view. Here, we have every indication that we are clear on Anne Bronte's philosophical standpoint here. And yet, it's being said by someone who we are also seeing as riddled with hubris at the moment. And we know something pretty bad has to happen to her eventually, because when she showed up at the beginning of the book, she was alone with a child. So that hubris seems to be barreling down the track at her head. And to some extent, that would indicate that perhaps the aunt's arguments, maybe not this theological one, but her aunt's arguments in general, have been correct when it comes to at least Mr. Huntington. It's an interesting trick of writing that Bronte pulled off here. And I just realized I've been throwing around hubris like everybody is in touch with that term because we did Frankenstein 10 years ago. So hubris is the so proud of your own thinking, your own position, so confident, so overconfident that you're right, that you are inviting disaster. It's the pride goeth before the fall. You are setting yourself up. It's Victor Frankenstein saying, look, I can create life just like God. And then the universe comes along and smacks you on the head because hubris. So we have this hubris from this hubris. We have this moment of hubris coming from Helen where she says his family really screwed him up and I'm going to undo all of that mess because me. At the same time, you have this exposed moment of really low self-esteem and emotional fragility when Huntingdon is talking to her and saying, "Oh, your uncle, I'm sure that he's going to say yes, but your aunt, and what about your dad?" And your dad's not going to say yes to something that your aunt is against, right? And and then she says, "No, I don't think he cares enough about me." Having a broken relationship like that with your father, and then having a father figure who is funny and kind and lighthearted, but also not really so good on the guiding and raising the child part of the thing, is not necessarily healthy for a young female person. It's not necessarily healthy for any kid who's being raised to have come out at the ripe old age of 18, to have come out of the last 18 years feeling like one of your two parental units just doesn't care that much about you. That's not going to be good. So we've got a lot of complicated emotional stuff for Helen heading into, apparently, a marriage. And we have a lot of complicated religious underpinnings to all of this. So there are some really interesting struggles going on in Helen/Anne on the God as love and guidance, God as a disciplinarian, God as a doctrinarian, and God of love, and then how that all translates into a relationship, especially if you're putting yourself forward as the one who is going to be the guider of good behavior in the relationship instead of the guidee. You can see where things are going to start getting really complicated, right? All right. Whew. There was a lot. And this is one of those chapters to bookmark if you need to come back and listen to it later. Chapter 20. You can make a note, because this is not going to be the last time we hear about things like this. All right. Have a great week. I will talk to you later. Be well. Take care of each other. Wear a mask. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. A big thanks to all the Craftlit listeners who support the show by being a premium audio member via craftlit.com/premium or via patreon.com/craftlit. Your support for the show is what's kept us going since 2006. If you feel like getting free audio pretty much every week, please consider supporting the show by heading over to patreon.com/craftlit and pledging what you feel the show is worth to you. If you can't support the show that way, consider leaving a review at iTunes or at our facebook.com/craftlit page, or follow @craftlit on Twitter and share the show with your followers too. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.